And then there can be what we have called very indirect effects if climate change induces human actions that can then indirectly impact on human health. For example, when climate change would lead to food shortages in other parts of the world and would lead to political destabilization, that could indirectly or very indirectly have an impact on population health in the Netherlands too. We then made a review of the literature and looked at what was known about this currently in the Netherlands, and the main consequences of climate change for health in the Netherlands were found to be in these 5 areas. For each of these 5 areas we found rather convincing evidence that climate change has already affected population health in the Netherlands and can be expected to further affect population health between now and 2030. The first area is that of higher temperatures and the consequences in terms of more heat stress, more heat waves, which are likely to lead to certain health problems now and in the future. I will review that in more detail later on. The second area where there are health risks is the area of flooding. I mentioned flooding before. There is an increased risk of flooding, both particularly from peak flows in river water, and from our literature review it appeared that although the risk of the health risks of flooding in the direct sense, in the sense of drowning, are quite limited because we have not only good protection but also evacuation measures when there is a severe risk of flooding. The mental health risk of flooding are actually quite substantial. We've had a number of events in the Netherlands where large areas have been evacuated when there was a serious risk of flooding from river water, and in health assessments of these evacuations it appeared that many people were actually suffering from something like a post-traumatic stress disorder after these evacuations, which of course are quite important events in people's lives. So there are certain mental health risks of flooding, particularly the evacuation that may be needed to prevent drowning and other more physical health effects of flooding. The third area where we found clear indications that climate change would affect population health in the Netherlands is the area of allergic disease. Due to warming, climate change in the Netherlands, the length of the pollen season has increased quite substantially, and as a result there is already a clear rise in hay fever and asthma, and this can be expected to further increase in the future. Tens of thousands of cases of hay fever and asthma have been observed, in excess of those that were observed previously, and this is a third area where serious health risks can be seen. The fourth area is that of vector-borne diseases. That's another area that I will review in more detail in a minute, so I'll not spend time on it now. And then the fifth area is that of microbiological contamination of food and water. The simple effect of higher temperatures of food and water will also lead to a higher likelihood of microbiological contamination, not only of food and water that is ingested by people by drinking and by eating, but also of swimming water that people can inadvertently ingest and can be contaminated microbiologically. Here again, currently already we see a higher frequency of those infections and contaminations, and that can be expected to increase in the future. These are the 5 areas where we expect effects on population health, and I'll review in more detail the first and the fourth of these areas, starting with temperature and heat stress. That is actually an area where we already know quite a bit about, because the association between temperature and mortality can be observed quite easily in the recent past. This V-shaped figure that we observe of the relationship between average daily temperature and the level of mortality has been seen not only in the Netherlands but in many other countries. In the Netherlands, the optimum temperature for human health, average daily temperature, is around 16 degrees centigrade. When temperature goes down, mortality goes up slowly, but usually, on the average, cold winter temperatures lead to an excess of mortality in the order of 20 or 30%. And when temperature goes up from this optimum, also mortality goes up, and more steeply than with temperatures going down. During heat waves, you usually observe quite substantial increases in mortality in the Netherlands. And these higher mortality levels during heat waves are the result of increases in mortality from cardiovascular disease, from respiratory conditions, and in both cases these effects are most strongly observed among elderly people. That's true for the Netherlands, that's true for many other countries, and it's quite likely that with increases in the frequency of heat waves in the near future, that we will also see more excess deaths during summer. It has been predicted that as a result of climate change, the frequency of heat waves will increase further. Actually, the European heat wave of 2003 that we have seen, and that I will come back to in a minute, the likelihood of such a heat wave has been estimated to have been doubled due to greenhouse gas emissions in the recent past. We've had, of course, several heat waves in the recent past, and on the basis of heat waves in the period between 1979 and 1997, these graphs that I just saw have been observed. There usually is an excess in the order of about 12% of excess mortality, adding up to 40 excess deaths per day in the Netherlands during a typical heat wave, particularly due to respiratory and cardiovascular conditions, and limited mostly to elderly people. And then on the basis of this historical experience, it was not so difficult to calculate the excess deaths during the 2003 heat wave. This is depicted in this graph, and we see actually that the number of deaths goes up almost immediately with temperatures going up. There is almost no delay in the excess number of deaths when temperature goes up. This heat wave in 2003 had excess deaths in a number of European countries. The map here shows the highest temperatures observed, and as you see, the highest temperatures were actually seen in France, but they were also seen in a number of other European countries. Estimates for the number of excess deaths in Europe during this heat wave are presented here. More than half of the excess deaths were observed in France, which also had the highest temperatures. Many analyses have been made of this particular heat wave, and this graph or this slide compares the results of these analyses for France and for the Netherlands, and there are large similarities, although the excess deaths in France were much more substantial than in the Netherlands. Both in France and in the Netherlands, elderly were most vulnerable, but while those are the most vulnerable group, there were also excess deaths in younger people. It was not entirely limited to elderly people. And there has been a lot of attention to the possibility of so-called harvesting effects. These have been observed in previous heat waves, where usually one would see a peak in mortality during the heat wave, but then a deficit in deaths as compared to the normal level of mortality after the heat wave.